Have you ever lost someone? I mean, really lost them, in a way that gnaws at your soul and keeps you awake at night? That's what happened to my nephew Danny. He disappeared in the woods one summer, and for 3 days we searched for him. When we found him, he wasn't the same. I wish I could say it ended there, but the truth is, I'm not sure we ever really brought him back. It happened last summer, during a family camping trip. My sister Lisa and her husband Dan had invited me to join them at Stone Hollow, a state park known for its endless hiking trails and dense woods. I brought my dog, Max, figuring it'd be a relaxing weekend outdoors. Danny, their 7-year-old son, was ecstatic. He loved the woods, climbing trees, chasing squirrels, pretending he was an explorer. I'd never seen a kid with so much energy. That first day was perfect. We set up camp, roasted hot dogs over the fire, and told ghost stories under the stars. Danny loved them, even though Lisa scolded me for scaring him before bed. The next morning, Danny begged us to take him on the longest trail in the park, one that led to a scenic overlook about 3 miles from the campsite. It was an easy hike, well marked, and we figured we'd be back by lunchtime. But things didn't go as planned. Danny ran ahead, as usual, darting between the trees, with Max close behind. I shouted for him to stay where we could see him, and for a while he listened, circling back to show us a cool rock or a stick he'd found. About halfway to the overlook, we reached a fork in the trail. One path was wide and well-worn, the other was narrower, overgrown, and marked with an old wooden sign that had long since faded. "Danny, stay on the main path," Lisa said, her voice firm, but Danny was already heading down the narrower trail. "It's a shortcut," he called out, grinning over his shoulder. "Come back," Lisa shouted, but he didn't stop. Max barked and took off after him, disappearing into the trees. I ran after them, calling Danny's name. The trail was steeper than it looked, winding downhill through dense underbrush. I could hear Max barking somewhere ahead, but couldn't see him or Danny. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. No barking, no footsteps. Just the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Danny?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer. We spent hours searching for him. Lisa was frantic, calling his name over and over until her voice was hoarse. Dan and I fanned out, combing the area, but the trail seemed to twist and double back on itself, leading nowhere. When the sun began to set, we called the park rangers. They brought in a search team, volunteers, dogs, even a helicopter, but no one could find him. Max came back that night, whimpering and shaking, but there was no sign of Danny. We stayed up all night at the campsite, huddled around the fire. Lisa cried into her hands while Dan stared into the flames, his face blank. I tried to reassure them, but deep down I felt it too, that sinking dread that we'd never see Danny again. The next morning, the search resumed. The rangers found footprints leading off the trail, but they ended abruptly in a patch of soft dirt. "It's like he just disappeared," one of them said, shaking his head. Lisa refused to leave the area, insisting that Danny was still out there. "He's smart," she said, over and over, as if trying to convince herself. "He'll find his way back." But as the hours passed, her hope began to waver. That afternoon, one of the volunteers, a local man in his 60s, pulled me aside. "You need to be careful out here," he said, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Stone Hollow's got stories," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "People disappearing. Kids, mostly. They say there's something in the woods that takes them." I laughed nervously. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" The man didn't smile. All I'm saying is, if you find him, he might not be the same. It wasn't until the third day that we found him. Lisa was the one who spotted him, sitting at the base of a large oak tree about a mile from the campsite. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt, but he didn't look scared or upset. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. "Danny!" Lisa cried, running to him. He looked up at her, his expression blank. "I'm tired," he said softly. We took him back to the campsite, wrapping him in a blanket and giving him water. He didn't say much, just kept repeating, "I'm tired. I want to go home." But something about him felt off. That night, while everyone else slept, I stayed up watching Danny. He was lying in the tent, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "Danny," I whispered. "What happened out there?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "They showed me the way," he said. "The way to what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat up and pointed toward the woods. "They're waiting," he said. I froze. "Who's waiting?" But Danny just lay back down, closing his eyes as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Danny seemed fine, almost too fine. He was cheerful, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. Lisa and Dan were relieved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. I unzipped the flap and saw Danny standing at the edge of the woods, his back to me. "Danny!" I hissed, climbing out of the tent. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just stepped into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I ran after him, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The trail twisted and turned, and I felt like I was running in circles. And then I saw them. Figures, pale and silent, standing between the trees. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel them watching me. "Danny!" I shouted, my voice shaking. He was standing in the middle of the trail, surrounded by the figures. They didn't touch him, but their presence was suffocating. "Go back," he said, his voice calm. "What are you talking about?" I said, stepping closer. "You don't belong here," he said. And then the figures stepped forward, blocking my view. I woke up at the campsite, lying next to the fire pit. Danny was sitting beside Lisa, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. I asked him about the night before, but he just smiled and said, "You must have had a bad dream." We left Stone Hollow that afternoon. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see those figures. I feel their eyes on me. And Danny? He's not the same. He still laughs, still plays, but there's something missing. Or maybe something extra. I don't know what happened to him in those woods, but one thing's for sure. Whatever came back wasn't entirely my nephew.